from MTN, the Montana Television Network. This is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Face the State on the Montana Television Network. I'm Mike Dennison, the Chief Political Reporter for MTN. And yes, today we're most certainly going to talk about Montana politics and politicians and campaigns. It's mid-November and the 2020 elections are now less than a year away. On the national stage, of course, the presidential race is already in full swing, but it's no less active here in Montana as more than 24 candidates are campaigning and jockeying for position in the state's major races for U.S. Senate, House, and Governor, and several other statewide offices. Those fields are probably about full, but we seem to be standing on an ever-shifting political landscape, both in Montana and the nation. We have many races in Montana that are wide open with multiple candidates, and the outcomes will have a lot to do with shaping the future direction and politics of the state. To help me read the latest tea leaves today, I have two guests. Chuck Deneau, a former executive director of the Montana Republican Party and now a political consultant with the Montana Group here in Helena. And Eric Stern, also from Helena, a former senior advisor to Democratic Governors Brian Schweitzer and Steve Bullock. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. Let's start off with Chuck, and both of you will answer this question. How big is the 2020 election in Montana? What's at stake here?
Well, you know, for Republicans, this is a huge election. It's an opportunity after 16 years to retake the governor's office and really solidify the momentum that Republicans have felt over the last couple of election cycles, where they've seen big wins in statewide elections and taking a lot of statewide offices. So from a Republican perspective, we really want to perform well, especially with the president at the top of the ticket.
And Eric, what about from your perspective? Is this a big election in Montana, and why?
It's huge. I mean, we haven't had a Republican governor since 2005. And the last time we had a Republican governor, things weren't going very well in the state. We had a lot of major problems. Budget crises, energy deregulation, the collapse of Montana Power. And so I think Democrats, things are going very well in Montana right now, and I think Democratic governors have shown that they can get the job done. And so I think there's a real open question as to why it is that we need a Republican governor. I don't think we do. And I think the data speaks for itself that the state is on the right track, and it would be smarter to continue the course.
And we'll let you argue with him in a little bit on that point, Chuck, but you both mentioned the governor's race. Of course, I think it's probably the top race in the state. I'll ask you this question. Greg Gianforte is running for governor, our current congressman, ran in 2016 and lost to Steve Bullock. Is he the odds-on favorite to take the governor's seat in 2020?
I think he's a slight favorite. The internal polling that I've seen shows him slightly ahead. There's been some public polls that you see out there that show him with a wild lead. I don't believe that that's the case. I do think he is a slight favorite. He has more name ID than Tim Fox's opponent. As you know, Fox is the Attorney General. But my prediction is that in the end, Fox is going to upset him.
Now, Chuck, I think you probably disagree with that. When we look at that Republican primary, we have Mr. Gianforte, as he mentioned, Tim Fox, the Attorney General, and State Senator Al Olszewski. You think that Gianforte is a pretty good bet to win?
I do. I think Gianforte's in the driver's seat for the Republican nomination. He's outpaced the other candidates in fundraising by a very wide margin. He's very popular with the Republican base. He's won 2 statewide elections in just the last couple of years. And I think he's got, you know, the advantage of name ID, money, and popularity. So I see him being the nominee.
I mean, he definitely has the money. He is going to buy, to attempt to buy this race. He will spend probably he could spend as much as $15 million of his own money to try to win this thing. There's no question he has a massive advantage over Tim Fox in that regard. I don't agree with Chuck. I think there are a lot of Republicans that specifically dislike him. I also think that he is, if you look at any polling and you look across the political spectrum, he is the least popular elected official in Montana. He is routinely in the high 30s in job approval. And when you're in the high 30s, you're a stink bomb. You're not popular. People don't like you.
So are you saying that Democrats are rooting for Gianforte to win the primary? Are they the ones that you think that
I suspect that the Democrats would rather run against Gianforte than Fox. Yeah.
And Chuck, what about Mr. Gianforte? He mentioned he thinks that he is not that popular among Republicans. And I know just from talking to people within the party, there are a lot of people who are somewhat resentful of Gianforte, and these are party regulars, maybe not the average voter, saying, you know, he won the congressional seat, and now he's turning around and running for governor right away. And do you sense that at all, or is that just some malcontents here and there?
Well, you know, first on his electability, I mean, he's proven it a couple of times in the last couple of years that he, you know, and that's really the only poll that matters is those elections. He won in 2018 by 5 points in a year that was very favorable to Democrats, and he still won a resounding victory. And I think he's going to show that again in the governor's race.
Now, you heard Eric's comments earlier about how things have been so good under Democratic governors. Of course, Republicans have controlled the legislature for a lot of that time, and now they're looking forward to having their own in the governor's chair. Why should people choose a Republican governor? What would be good about that? What's going to be the argument?
Well, I think, you know, a lot of it's going to come down to jobs in the economy. You know, after 16 years, we're still near the bottom nationally in a lot of economic categories. And I think there's a real appetite out there across Montana for somebody that can improve the economy, create more jobs, and more opportunity for Montanans.
And what policies do you think Republican governors would put into place that haven't happened that would result in that?
You know, that's a good question. I think we're due for some tax reform. The Democratic governors in the legislature have nibbled away at certain tax issues over the past 16 years, but no major overhauls. I think it might be time to look at something like that. You know, things like business equipment tax, income tax, et cetera. And beyond that, I think we've got too many regulations. I think we need somebody that can come in and make it easier for businesses to thrive in Montana.
We are rated in anyone who does ratings of states nationally about business climate says Montana has one of the best business climates in America, one of the best startup climates in America. We have more startups per capita in Montana than any state in America right now. We have the lowest unemployment rate practically in 100, one of the lowest in a century. So I don't know where Chuck gets his data, but this state is very strong right now. And you know, in terms of what we're discussing, what a Republican governor might do with what will probably continue to be a Republican legislature, I can tell you that it will be probably a sales tax, and it will be some kind of weird ideas about public lands that the Republicans are always trying to push, and they don't come out in the form of a bill only because the governor always vetoes them. So this is a very, very, very big election, and the consequences are real. And I might add that, you know, the thing that they will absolutely do is cut taxes for the wealthiest Montanans, because they did that the last time you had a Republican governor.
Under Judy Martz.
Yes, yes. And so you can absolutely expect that to be something that comes out of a Republican administration. And I'm not sure that that's something that Montanans really want or support, but they will do it.
Chuck, I'm going to let you answer that in just a second, some of those things, if you choose to. But I want to come back to you, Eric, on something else. You know, can Democrats win this race, the governor's race? We don't really have a heavyweight candidate in the mix, do we?
Well, we have the lieutenant governor, Mike Cooney. Mm-hmm. He's been around Montana politics a long time, very smart, knows this stuff, has a good reputation. And we have Whitney Williams, who is sort of a younger generation, is a woman, which is something that I think it comes with great benefit in politics nowadays. And I think she's very successful. She's a successful businesswoman, and she's, you know, has the potential to raise a lot of money to bring to bear in the event that you're running against Gianforte, who obviously he will have an unlimited amount of money. So I do think we have two very potentially strong candidates. We don't really know what they're going to be like yet because we haven't seen them battle through the primary. Right. These are two guys. This is a guy and a gal that have not yet really run a really, really nasty big-time race. So we're going to see, and that primary will be competitive. I don't know that it'll be necessarily nasty, but it'll be competitive, and it'll be tough for either of them to get out of.
I have two things for you, Chuck. First of all, you heard him talk about certainly the campaign points we're going to hear from Democrats, that Republican governor candidates, they're going to come in, they're going to cut taxes for the wealthy, and they're going to have a sales tax. Is that true?
Nobody's talking about sales tax. I don't know where that's coming from.
Gianforte has talked about it his whole career.
Well, he was against it last time, though, in 2016.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Nobody I'm aware of is for a sales tax. That's not going to happen. That's not on the table. And typically the tax cut proposals that we've seen in the past in the Republican legislature have been across the board for everybody. So I think that's, in terms of tax reform, that's where they might go. To me, the real interesting question in the governor's race is in this Democratic primary. And Eric kind of made a nice contrast there. You've got the career politician, Mike Cooney, who's been in office, first elected 43 years ago. Talk about a career politician, and then the young, new, fresh face, Whitney Williams. So Democrats are going to have a real choice there. Do you go with the tried and true kind of old school Democrat, or somebody that's new, progressive, a little more leftist, and is coming with some new policies? And I think that could be dangerous for the Democrats to elect somebody that looks more like AOC than the type of Democrats that have been successful in Montana.
Now, in the Republican primary, we talked already a little bit about Mr. Fox versus Mr. Gianforte, the kind of the two leading candidates. Is there any concern that, I think that's going to be a pretty nasty race. Is there any concern that could be harmful to whoever comes out of that primary?
It could be. You always see that those wounds that are inflicted in the primary kind of linger into the general. But it's to be seen how nasty that gets. Fox at this point has not had real great fundraising. He's not going to be able to mount a real big campaign. So certainly he's going to have to go after Gianforte to make any impact in the race, but the magnitude of that is to be seen.
Okay.
No, I agree with that. He is going to have to go after him.
Yeah.
He's going to have to do it to make up in what he lacks in funding.
Let's move on to talk about the U.S. House race. Of course, we're talking about Montana's only seat in Congress, which is open because Gianforte is running for governor. It looks pretty much like we're going to have Kathleen Williams versus Matt Rosendale. Would you agree?
I'd say almost certainly.
Yeah. And who's the favorite, and what will it turn on?
Rosendale's a slight favorite. That House seat war has been waged for that House seat for decades, and Democrats can't get there. So you have to give them the statistical edge. But I think that Rosendale has a problem that's similar to Gianforte. I'm not sure the Republicans really like him that much. And so when that is the case, it's always a problem for a candidate when his own party's not crazy about him. Democrats really like Kathleen Williams. So I expect it to be close. And I think there is a chance. And of course, this goes to the bigger issue of what the electorate is going to look like in 2020. How many Democrats come out to sort of vote against Trump? That's the big question. What does the Democratic turnout look like?
We'll talk more about that.
And if it's big enough, I think Kathleen can beat him.
And Chuck, let's talk about that primary. Of course, we should, Chuck and his group have done some work on behalf of candidate Rosendale. We'll just let everybody know that. But can anyone really challenge Rosendale in the primary? I mean, he's got a huge fundraising lead. There are 4 other candidates. But I think there are some concerns from some Republicans that he may not be the best general election candidate just because he's run before and lost last year. What do you think?
Well, he did run before and lost, but it was by 3 points against an incumbent United States senator. I think that's pretty good.
Yeah. Well.
He's got an insurmountable fundraising lead at this point, I think, unless something dramatic were to change with some of these other candidates. None of the challengers really have any resources to mount a successful challenge to him. So Rosendale, with his name ID where it's at and his fundraising capabilities, I think he's the odds-on favorite.
But do you think he's at all vulnerable to the attacks we know we're going to see, calling him Maryland Matt? He's an out-of-stater. He's a rich guy. The same stuff that they threw at him last year.
I'd love to see California Kathleen go after Maryland Matt. I mean, so I think that argument's off the table this election cycle. And we have to remember that Kathleen Williams lost by 5 points in 2018, which is a very favorable year for Democrats. We saw Democrats win congressional seats all over the country. 2020 is not going to be as friendly for her. And with the president on the ticket, I think the Republicans really have an advantage. That said, this is going to be a competitive race. Mm-hmm. She's certainly one of the Democrats' strongest candidates, and has shown that she can be tough.
Do you think that Montanans will elect a somewhat liberal woman who's never held statewide office as their representative in Congress?
Yeah, never having held office is a plus. I mean, people like Brian Schweitzer use that to their advantage. That's always been something that people use to their advantage in the state. So I don't think that's an issue. Her politics are, she's a Democrat, and that just puts her at a slight disadvantage in a race for a federal office, and we'll see what happens.
Okay. One last question about this race. We have 8 candidates running, and we have the 2 kind of leading candidates, one Republican, one Democrat, and we've got a bunch of other ones. Do you think there's any, these people are kind of trying themselves out in anticipation of a possible race in 2022 when we have maybe 2 districts, maybe an additional district? Is that going on here at all?
There's always some of that. People, testing the waters, getting some name ID and looking towards the future. I just want to add one thing. I think the biggest question in this race right now that it's shocking that the media hasn't asked this of Kathleen yet is where is she at on the impeachment? I mean, certainly Nancy Pelosi expects Kathleen Williams to come in and vote with the Democrats to impeach the president, but she's been silent on the issue. I think Montanans would really like to know where she's at.
You think they would?
I don't know that Montanans necessarily care about that right now. I think there are bigger issues for them.
We can certainly ask her, although by the time she got elected, I think it would be over by then, of course. But still, yeah, it's something that I think will be asked. And she's not the nominee yet either, but still.
I got to add that, Trump, that issue might have been more important a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. Trump is now no longer popular in Montana. He is more unpopular than popular. The last poll says that he is 48 popular, 49 unpopular.
And which poll is that?
That was the Morning Consult. They rate they do all the polling in the 50 states. And so that's the first poll we've seen where he's underwater. So if he keeps going in that direction, it's going to have major implications for the congressional and the Senate races.
We're definitely going to come back and talk more about the Trump factor and other factors involved in all of these races. Let's move on now to the U.S. Senate race. Of course, we're talking about Senator Steve Daines, the incumbent Republican, up for re-election, trying to become only the 2nd Republican senator in the history of Montana to be re-elected by the people. Conrad Burns did it, twice did he? So Daines is trying to become the 2nd person in that regard. And not any big names in the field of the Democrats. Can an unknown Democrat really mount a serious challenge, do you think, to Mr. Daines?
I don't think any of these Democrats in the race have done anything to differentiate themselves as a real contender. So no, unless Governor Bullock decides to come back and run, this is going to be really tough for Democrats.
And what's your thought, Eric, on that race? Can Democrats make this a race? And I think all of us seem to be in agreement that Mr. Bullock is not going to get into that race. I don't think he is.
I don't know the answer to that. He says he doesn't want to run for it. But I will tell you, I agree with Chuck that the other 2 guys, the rest of the field, probably not a great chance against Steve Daines. I do believe that if Bullock were to run, he would beat him. Daines has one problem that I think you're going to hear about a lot going forward, and that is that he doesn't meet with Montanans. He doesn't give speeches to crowds. He only talks to controlled crowds where he knows that his own supporters are the only ones that are there. I think that and Gianforte does that to a certain extent as well. I think that is a huge liability for a politician in a state like Montana. Access to our elected officials in this state is expected, and I think he has caused himself sort of a serious problem by taking that policy.
And he's brought up an interesting issue. I think we're probably going to hear that argument against both Senator Daines and Mr. Gianforte, that they don't have as many public, open meetings with people as someone like, say, Senator Tester. Do you think that's a legitimate criticism at all?
I think voters are more interested in things like jobs in the economy and border security and international trade, a litany of other issues. So I don't think that's going to be a big campaign issue.
Okay. When you look at the Democratic candidates who are vying to take on Steve Daines now, is there any one there that Republicans fear more than others, or do they just look at them and think, we don't really care? Because they're not that well known.
I'm afraid it's more the latter. It's none of them are really distinguished. Perhaps one will emerge, but the only one I think that instills fear, like you say, is Governor Bullock, and he's made it very difficult for himself to come back and run. He's staked out some very leftist positions on, banning semi-automatic rifles, opposing the border wall.
A majority of Montanans believe that semi-automatic rifles should be banned. So I don't know. I don't think that's leftist.
I'm not sure that, I'd be interested to see those polling numbers.
The assault weapons ban has always polled above 50% in Montana.
I don't know if we'll get to test that this Senate race or not. Probably not. But let's come back to something that Eric mentioned, that is the factor of the president being at the top of the ticket. And most Republicans I talk to, yourself included, think that's going to be a positive for Republicans in Montana next year. I'm wondering if that's really the case. Is there any concern, just what's going on with impeachment and lots of other things, that may not be the good whole card?
I think that the president is stronger than he's ever been. I think a lot of Republicans in Montana, a lot of Republicans that were leery of him in 2016 are really pleasantly surprised with how conservative a president he's been in all of his policies. And they know that the left is after him with this impeachment scam. So I think, you know, we're going to see very strong Republican turnout in this election. We're going to see very strong Democrat turnout too. Both sides are supercharged on this election.
Yeah,
And I agree. The conservatives are going to come out strong too, and then that's the problem for Democrats, is that it's not just the anti-Trump, energy. There is pro-Trump love too, and that is obviously, it really does negate the fact that even though he is an unpopular leader nationally, in Montana he brings people out to vote for him.
Of course, the last election, 2018, we had 70% turnout in an off-year election, the highest I can ever remember in my career.
And this will beat that.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's say we have like 80% turnout, which I think is a possibility. I mean, the conventional wisdom has been that advantages Democrats, but maybe not. Maybe. What do you think?
Maybe it doesn't advantage anyone. But I think that the way Trump is behaving lately has energized Democrats more than it's energized his fans. And I also think he's got problems in a state like Montana with things like tariffs, which hurt farmers, and that's the Republican base. And when you are hurting your own voters, that creates problems at the polls.
Now, we've talked a lot about the horse race aspect. We've talked a little bit about issues, both of you, but I'm just wondering, what do you think are going to be, the number one or two issues specifically that this race may turn on and that candidates are going to be talking about or should be talking about?
In statewide races?
Yeah, in Montana with the statewide races, and even locally too.
The Trump factor is going to play there too, because we've seen him nationalize so many state races. We just saw that in those elections last week in places like Kentucky. So I think voters are going to hear a lot about things like border security and trade. But specific to the state, public lands is perennially a big issue, and I think Republicans have done a lot better job recently pushing some policies to increase access to public land through incentives. But the big one's always jobs in the economy. I think people are hungry for somebody who can improve this economy and create more opportunity here.
So what are Democrats, when they're running statewide, especially for governor or any race, what are going to be the top things they're going to talk about to people and say, here's what we stand for, here's why we should vote for us?
They've created health care. They've gotten health care for 90,000 Montanans that didn't have it before. That's the Medicaid expansion. Mm-hmm. So I think that's very important. And I think on public lands, what Chuck is effectively saying is that the Republicans are starting to try to realize that they were in the wrong place for a long time, and sort of embracing ideas that were very unpopular. Democrats have done very well at the polls the last decade talking about protecting public lands and talking about the fact that a lot of Republicans want to do things like transfer federal public lands to the state or sell off public lands privately. And I think what has happened is those things have caused lasting damage politically to the Republican Party. And so now you're seeing people like Daines and Gianforte try to talk a little more like Democrats.
Now you mentioned public lands and the issues you mentioned. We haven't talked much about kind of the rural-urban split we see in Montana. Democrats still do fairly well in most cities, and they just get killed in rural areas. First off, I'll go to Chuck first. Where do you think, how can Republicans make more inroads into the urban areas where they are getting beaten pretty badly?
That's a good question. I think they've just got to remain true to their principles, lay out a coherent agenda on what they're going to do on things like taxes and the economy, and focus more on those issues that Montanans really care about, those pocketbook issues.
And what about Democrats in rural areas? They don't control a single district outside of an Indian reservation in rural Montana that I can recall. Maybe there's one that I'm forgetting. But how are Democrats going to appeal to rural voters?
I think you started to see a little bit with the Medicaid expansion, because that kept rural hospitals open. rural hospitals were shutting down, and with that help, they are staying open. And I think Democrats have to do a better job of talking about that thing. I also think they have to talk more about tariffs and the implication, what the effect on farmers and other small businesses.
Okay. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is kind of a wild card here is the legalization of marijuana, which may or may not be on the ballot. Let's just assume that it is on the ballot. They got a lot of work to do to get it on the ballot, maybe 2 initiatives. How might that affect turnout in terms of who does that bring to the polls? Does it really matter, Chuck?
You know, I don't think it affects turnout, to be honest with you, because normally it would, but the only thing that's driving turnout this election is Trump. You know, I don't think anybody's showing up to the polls because of marijuana who wasn't already there because they love Trump or hate Trump. So we may see a little organized opposition. There's been a national group that's gotten involved in some of these state races, but I don't think it's as partisan an issue as it used to be in the past, and so I don't see it being an effect on other races.
Do you agree with that or not?
You know, it's hard to say. I think in other years I would agree with. In other years I would think that this type of thing on the ballot would really draw out a lot of young voters. But I think Chuck may be right. Those folks are likely coming out anyway right now to voice their displeasure with Trump. And of course, the other question is who the presidential nominee is, and are they coming out to vote for that person? I think you'll get a little bit of an effect from popping on the ballot. I don't know how big it's going to be.
On the presidential nominee, I'm glad you mentioned that. Who do Republicans most want to see at the top of the Democratic ticket? What would be good for them in Montana?
You know, and I'm glad you asked that because I think, because it's going to affect what happens down ballot for Democrats. You know, if it's a moderate, somebody more like Joe Biden, I think that reflects better on those down ballot Democrats. But if it's one of these socialist Democrats like Bernie or Elizabeth Warren, that's going to cast a negative light down the ticket as well and be a real disadvantage for Democrats.
What do you think, Eric, about that?
I don't think message-wise it doesn't hurt. Whoever is on the ballot for the presidency doesn't affect the candidates running for state offices. It's purely a question of, are they bringing out extra Democratic voters like Obama did? Obama got 47% of the vote in Montana. That was almost 10 points higher than anybody else has done in the last 20 years. So I honestly think that someone like a Sanders, put aside Bullock, assuming that he's not the guy, somebody like Sanders or Buttigieg will bring out young voters. And so I think that I don't think that their message is anything that's going to bother Montana voters to the point where it will affect other candidates.
Okay. We're getting kind of down toward the end of our show here. I'm just one last thought. Chuck, if you could single out one thing to watch in this upcoming election year that may be most important that we don't expect, what would it be?
Oh, man. I'm not sure. You know, the biggest thing is going to be this governor's race, which is expected. But that's going to be where all the time and attention is. I think that's going to be, it could be one of the more competitive ones. You know, it's the biggest opportunity for both sides. So I think that's the one to watch.
Well, and as you said, and we've talked about it, it means a lot for Montana going forward. What about you, Eric? What's the one thing that you could pick one thing to look at? What's it going to be?
Yeah, it's the governor's races. That's the big show. That's the big show, and you know, it's going to be a lot of talk about New Jersey. As somebody from New Jersey, I appreciate that. So.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us this morning here on Face the State. We've been talking about the 2020 elections in Montana. You can join me again next month when I'll probably be returning to the subject along with former MTN analyst David Parker. So I'll see you again in December. Thanks for joining us.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.